tonight to the School of Urban and Regional Planning and Department of Architectural Science lecture series. This lecture is taking place on the unceded territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit and the Haudenosaunee territory that's governed by the Dish-with-One-Spoon and Wampum Belt Covenants. It's an agreement between the Iroquois and the Ojibwe Confederacies to peaceably share and care for the lands around the Great Lakes. I think it's important for us to reflect on what that means. When we think about the Iroquois and Ojibwe Confederacies, that means that, back in a very long time ago, hundreds of years ago, we actually had democracy here in North America at a time when in Europe we were actually still underneath a feudal rule. And so we think about the actual civilization that existed here before here. It's important to think about what that means to this land and this territory and how it was governed before we came. So it's my pleasure to bring together this important lecture here at Ryerson for both of our schools. The Department of Architectural Science and School of Urban and Regional Planning have been forging ties together through the lecture series, through studios, and more efforts to work interdisciplinary together. So when we think about what this means today, we have two major sponsors. One is the Marjorie Winkler Award Fund, which is sponsored by the Winkler family each year to sponsor a lecture that is focused on landscape in honor of the late Marjorie Winkler. So we'd like to thank the family very much, who are sitting here in the middle of our area today. We also need to thank the sponsors from the School of Urban and Regional Planning side, and that is a gift from Ellen and Heather Simpson in honor of their late father, Raymond J. Simpson, who was a founding partner of Hempson Consulting, and Hempson Consulting joined them to sponsor our entire lecture series. So they're sitting here in front, so thank you very much to them as well. As part of a partnership, my name's Dr. Sheila McCartney, but I want to welcome Cheryl Atkinson from the Department of Architectural Science up here to introduce our speaker tonight.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. We are really pleased to have Marion Weiss here tonight from MANFREDI Weiss to present to us. Unfortunately, Michael couldn't come tonight. We were going to have them both as a double whammy, but he's not feeling well, so I'm sure Marion will do just fine. I just want to say that their firm is one of my favorite firms, and I've always admired their work. I've been to the Sculpture Park in Seattle, and we're pleased also to have them in the city working on an actual project. So they're working with Teeple Architects, another favorite firm, in Toronto right now on a building for U of T at the corner of College and University Avenue. So something to look forward to. I think what's really great about their work is the way that they're multidisciplinary experts. They're experts in not only architecture, but landscape urbanism, landscape design, and art, public art. And they bring that expertise to every project, but they also make their projects, they bring that an integrated approach to every project. So they use that approach and that multidisciplinarity to solve problems. Big urban problems like, as in the Olympic Park, a waterfront that's been divorced from the city by an expressway. So it's an approach, and it's an approach that's successful, and we hope to see more of their work tonight that uses that approach. I'm just going to give a little background on the firm. Marion and Michael worked together at Mitchell Jurgela's office where they met, and both had careers as academics before winning a competition that launched the firm in 1989. Marion's currently Graham Chair Professor of Architecture and a tenured faculty member of the University of Pennsylvania, and has also taught design at Harvard, Cornell, and Yale. The firm has won multiple awards, including an award in urban design and architecture and landscape design, a progressive architecture award, multiple AIA awards, an ASLA honor award, the EDRA Places Award, and was the first North American project to be, I guess we're talking now about the Olympic Park. It was the first North American project to be awarded the Harvard University International Veronica Rudge Green Place Prize in Urban Design. Weiss MANFREDI has received an Academy Award for Architecture from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, an Architectural League Emerging Voices Award, and the New York AIA Gold Medal of Honor, the New York AIA President's Award, and the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award for Architecture and Design, amongst many others. They've also had multiple exhibitions nationally and internationally. Including the Groundswell Show at the Museum of Modern Art. They've exhibited at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, the National Building Museum, Max Protech Gallery, Harvard, Yale, UPenn, Columbia, and the Van Allen Institute, the Architectural League of New York, Storefront for Art and Architecture, the Essen Germany Design Center, and the Sao Paulo International Biennale, the European Landscape Biennale, and last fall at the Venice Architectural Biennale, where our students saw their work. So I'll turn the podium over to Marion.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you all for coming. And I think one of the reasons that it's so exciting to be here at Ryerson is to be able to give a talk at an institution that really spans building science to planning and actually looked at the incredible breadth and strategic thinking all the way down to the tactile impact of how we build. And in fact, MANFREDI and I started our practice because we were so aware that there was this desire to kind of polish the top of the, I think you need to use the mic. Is this working? Is that better? Yes. Okay. In any case, I was saying what was compelling about being able to give a talk here at Ryerson is that what I admire here is the incredible stretch between architectural building science at one end, planning and strategic thinking at the other, and in a sense creating a framework where the territory of design is not isolated to polishing the top of the architectural pyramid, the perfect building, but in fact looking at a broader terrain that is often unseen in the world of design. And Michael and I started our practice with this sense that there was something a little too tiny about the top of the architectural pyramid, and that maybe we wanted to think about a larger territory for design. And in fact, the idea of perfection actually seemed to reside in many ways, not just the silhouette of the perfect building, but also you could say even perfect urban design was striving towards something like the perfect circle. Why? For full fortification, to keep things out and away and to protect that which is within. So even when you look at the Villa Piloto here, Três Lagoas, Brazil, where you think about a temporary community set it up for a work camp, that perfect circle, again, about creating a territory, is a framework for thinking, but in fact, that's not the way most of the world operates. And if we think about New York at night and we think of Toronto at night, what you realize is that we actually have more common ground than ever with urban life being framed by systems that are open-ended and continuous. So in fact, as we started to think about why we formed our practice and why we were dissatisfied with traditional architectural practice, we found ourselves drawn, if you will, by the ideal of what landscape might be, or even, and you could see Roe Etheridge's Junction Atlanta photo, by, in a sense, the terrain, space, and power of the form that infrastructure could engage. All of these being open-ended, all of these operating fully outside the property boundaries that a traditional architectural project might be. And so some of this idea of network thinking obviously is not new. And if you look at the Sixtus V creating these axial destinations through landmarks and fountains, et cetera, through Rome, these were not only objects of beauty and important infrastructure because water was central, but they were connective tissues to link a community. So, but go back, But look what the net result was there. The Spanish Steps, Despeki Spanish Steps, the most extraordinary form, if you will, of urban infrastructure, spectacle, theater, architecture, art. We don't know what it is, but we know that there's something compelling about it. So, and you can even think of Maki's thinking, his systemic thinking about, when you think about his urban design thinking with Hillside Terrace, he could actually create a community where it's a collection of pure architecture, but also a system of engagement. Now, you could say that some of our crushes, if you will, are not fully architectural, but in fact, you could say the crush that Corbusier had with the idea of inhabitable infrastructure, of creating housing and movement all in the same place in the same terrain, has been a kind of compelling preoccupation about maybe the space between infrastructure and between these terrains that are undifferentiated could be a kind of you call it a wet dream here of our own, where we were actually in the space under the Brooklyn Bridge on and off ramps to create a destination that was unlikely and aquatic. And so much of our thinking, and Michael and I both teach, and we write books to help us actually unpack and redirect our thinking. And the most recent one is called Public Natures, because we're very preoccupied with the notion of the larger public dimension and potentially obligation of architecture. And that domain, in a sense, is one where an evolutionary idea of what infrastructure could be is something that we interrogate. The idea of social infrastructures actually having measure, particularly in the vertical terrain of a building. And the terms and conditions that we discuss these are terms that we're always trying to sharpen both internally within our office and also externally with our students. And so that really gets down to what we're sadly describing as an academic project. We hoped it would have been real. We placed but didn't win the Lower Dawnlands Toronto Wandering College. So we thought you might enjoy one of our early experiments here where we were looking at your city and looking at the impact of flooding as an excuse to think about a new kind of urban form. And so when we looked at what Hurricane Hazel did in 1954 and the kind of the whole Lower Don system forging its place into this one tiny place and making a sharp turn through a kind of fortified channel, we thought, wow, what a fabulous site. And what about that question, if this whole territory is the site of the competition, in fact, the site's truly much larger because water flow is so much greater. So we started to look at what would happen if we were to eliminate the one thing that was generating more flooding than we could imagine, which was the channel. And if we broke down the banks of the channel, water would want to flow in a couple of directions. And we just said, why don't we let ourselves relax that neck of the Lower Dawnlands with this kind of 300 meter floodplain, and then also an overflow channel. So you can start to see that this idea then started to take place with a territory that was landscape infused, but also development friendly, if you could possibly do that, and not eliminating too much of the infrastructure because we loved it and we thought it was cool. Now, the secondary flood channel then, we said, if we could actually create a spillway, we could also create a recreational playing area, and through that excavation have the default natural audience seats, if you will, on that hillside. We could also then leverage the area under the Gardner Expressway as a kind of one more layer of wetland infrastructure so that this kind of wandering craziness of those ramps could also inform this wetland running trail. So here you can see the kind of ultimate vision for the area, high density, low rise, but also say that these strands of fortification and relaxing fortification could actually culminate in something that might actually reach out to the edge of the city and coalesce with a lateral landmark and, of course, the vertical landmark for your city off in the distance. So this set up some preoccupations, and you'll see in the last project that we present that we got a chance to do something along these lines in New York City's waterfront. So just to know that we've been exercising our thinking here in your city. Most recently, we're very fortunate to talk about this idea of public natures, though, at the Venice Biennale in the fall. And this exhibition really was our saying that there's precedents that we lean heavily on and draw from. We don't want to conceal our treks. We want to celebrate them. And so 4 of our projects are on one side. On the other side, there are these hybrid projects that go back to ancient times and even more contemporary ones, seen in models. But we wanted to create an open-ended, almost urban-like space that you could wander in and out to see these models. Constructed it with a kind of lateral window. You can see it under construction here, so that you can also imagine what it takes to fabricate in Venice, not a straightforward operation. And in the Cordieri, unpacking literally the idea of an exhibition in short order with these kind of stained panels, Corian liner. And there you can start to see some precedents that you might even recognize in silhouette in the window. Those are a framework of ours from Chungachin, the Kaju Bridge, some Indian stepwells, Sydney Opera House. And then on the other side, 4 of our projects that hybridize literally this idea of urban spectacle and also territorial systems. And then you could see this above from the mezzanine with the film of our projects, and a few of those pieces of films will be embedded in tonight's presentation. But this really was an idea of almost coalescing a story, creating a space, and actually placing those values of landscape architecture and urbanism coming together. So this first project, the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, in many ways was a chance for us to say, what would happen if you were to build a visitor center? For a botanic garden, the last thing you want to do is to do a massive piece of architecture. And they wanted us to do it in the center of the garden, between a central berm on a main area. And we said at the interview, at the risk of losing the job, we said they chose the wrong site. And that if they could actually pull all the way to the edge of the city, that would be a better place for the center to pull people from the edge of the city and into the garden. And we sort of did these studies to say, what if it's 100% architectural at the edge of the city and 100% natural when it reaches the garden? These were origami studies. And through a kind of chameleon section, at the very bottom, you could see where it meets the city, and at the very top, you could see where it meets the garden. This idea of this unfolding invitation to enter the garden and somehow leave the city behind, and actually have choices, our favorite Flatiron corner, to say you can go to the left to the city or to the right into the garden. Come into the visitor center, if you will, but always be mindful of the garden, that it's a reason why you are there. And in this case, it's a 2-sided room that seats 160. I think it's the only one we know of. And we actually, a ginkgo tree that we had to pull down is actually that cladding of the material that you see in this event space. And it's a fabulous space acoustically, and that took a lot of work. But what it also is that it's a host of a 10,000 square foot garden, a new kind of experimental green roof. And in fact, you thread through the building, outdoors and undercover and back in, so it's a sort of a funny kind of condition of ambiguity between outdoors and indoors. And so the simultaneity of all garden above and all architecture below tracks down to the sense of pulling you in and through and into the garden. And then it's seasonally dynamic. You could say this is its sort of like shag moment in the fall with this rooftop there. And in fact, it's been something that the garden's very proud of, is that it's hosting new environmental and ecological and, if you will, new residents of its roof, some which they adore and some that they don't. But in fact, though, this idea of adding a new element to the environment of that garden is one that is something that can be just to the side of that main axial space, not dead center, just slipped into the hillside, not frontal, completely hidden from the Japanese garden, and in a sense toggling between being part of the city and being part of the garden. And so let's just see if I can get this one to work. Oh dear. Let's see. Those were the birds you were hearing earlier. But you can start to understand how this assembly of the roof is going on and also how it tended for itself seasonally. But for us, what became very important is to envision it as supporting linear feet of movement and not just as a place to enter. So that was sort of one end, if you will, the Brooklyn end. But then the other end, the hyper-urban end, becomes very, very different when you hit some of the brutalist architecture that Barnard College, Columbia University, as they operate in Upper Manhattan, have inherited, as I think Toronto, too, seems to have a collection of buildings that were fearful of the city as an identity, and so the hunkering down through lots of concrete. This is a campus center for Barnard College, a women's college associated with Columbia University. So when we were competing to do this 100,000 square foot building, one of the things we noticed is that there was a historic landscape and a contemporary landscape separated by about 20 feet. And they had a big plaza that was separating them. So we said, what would happen if we could think of this 100,000 square feet as both a lateral landscape that would connect that breakdown, and also a vertical landscape that might connect all the departments inside. You can see this gesture of connectivity that was aspirational in this sketch. And that aspiration actually made its way all the way into the realization of this idea of a kind of lantern on Broadway. But our goal was to say that vertical buildings can be antisocial, but if there can be view corridors that laterally take you up through the spaces, a sense of being able to see what is happening in the building and what's happening with the architecture studios above, the reading room below, the dining area and cafe, would make you feel part of a community and also intrigued and curious to see what else is going on. This is our magic carpet. This is a reading room we're reading down. We call it magic because it's made out of carpet squares that we custom designed, so if anybody stains something, you can rip it out, and it's all color variable so nobody notices how dirty it gets. But that's an academic project for you. But the idea of privacy sometimes is very important in buildings that are very public. These are kind of scrim efforts there. And the choreography then of what the kind of, if you will, the internal sectional identity and the lateral combination of glass panels and movement systems tie together, a notion that gets down to the material science that I think you all even study here at Ryerson. We had loved, and Michael and I both do a lot of drawings in charcoal, we love the idea of an indecisive precision to the actual surface of the material. So we said, what if we could actually work with glass and look at the possibility of an externally acid-etched, terracotta-colored, chromatically embedded glass that could actually have multiple identities throughout the course of the day. We spent a year experimenting with a European glass company. At the end of the day, I think it's the Canadians, Matt, is that right? Goldray came through. We had to go to Canada after our European partners failed. So I just want to say another shout out for Canada. So you can start to see that glass. We were literally experimenting here with different color backpans because the color of the glass is basically almost an amber brown. It's the backpan painted 4 inches behind fire engine red that gives you the color. That gradient indecision is what you see here with the frit. And then there's sort of breakout places, and of course we made the senior architecture studio space, of course, the one element that juts out over the campus and looks down on Columbia University, but that's just an inside joke. But you could also see that that is still also choreographing into this neighborhood of a kind of a brick-like neighborhood and changing its expression. But you could see it toggling with Columbia University on the right, and Barnard there in the middle, and you could start to see that connective landscape that links it together. And then the idea, of course, is that this is really a lantern of the strength of that kind of comprehensive cross-disciplinary programming that they have at Barnard. So again, a different idea then at Penn with the ThinkCentre for Nanotechnology. We were really excited to actually take a piece of the University of Pennsylvania campus that didn't have a speck of green and start to think about how we could actually build within this idea some of the framework of thinking about urban design of the university and also urban design of Philadelphia itself, all of which meant landscape was always a central identifying element. So being in the upper right as the outermost part of the campus, we said what could happen if we could drag that idea of the urban green all the way to this site. Interestingly enough, you can see our kind of conceptual model, and this is where we began, was something that just took the simplicity of the unfolded labs and then carved out and created the possibility of a new central green for this part of the campus. The interesting thing was that we actually discovered that there's so much vibration criteria that we could, all our labs had to be in the back, but we could actually have a public space in the front just because it had the only space without the vibration EMI criteria. In the inside, though, that amber glass that you see there is not just a kind of a cosmetic thing. We'll talk about it in a moment. But the idea of being able to see up and through the labs to feel connected became important. But that amber-colored glass is that if you've ever been to a clean room, you'll see usually they're all walled off with a little portal on the door, which is amber, and that's to keep the particular light rays that actually have an infrared discoloration for the research to keep it from coming in. So we said, well, what if we made the whole thing amber? And they couldn't say no. So we were able to do that. And what that did was that allowed that particular technical requirement to actually become part of the identity of the building. And now you can see these kind of inhabitable stairs. Because the elevators had to be so remote in all the corners because of the vibration electromagnetic interference, we actually had to make this irresistible stair that people would feel like they could connect and socialize and engage on because there's a 20-foot span of floor to floor. What is that, like 7 meters or whatever? So you actually have a big hike just to go from floor to floor. And again, though, the idea of these places of engagement and sight lines make it all the way up to the very top. This is the forum space, and it's this fabulous room that looks out over the campus and has its own green roof, which now actually has some sculpture on it. And it really is a kind of a lantern in this part of the campus. It really hasn't had either transparency or landscape. But it really is a kind of a beacon that draws in the kind of cross-disciplinary aspects of what nanoscience is doing at Penn. Now, there's a video. We'll see if I can make it work. Yes. The interesting thing about this building is here, this is fabulous Tony Park that was found for the university for the site. And you get a sense of this kind of chameleon nature of the building at night. It becomes this wild sort of lantern in the city. So again, this now goes on to this preoccupation with what an academy does. And an academy sometimes actually has to change the way a city builds. And Kent State, this was a competition that we won not so long ago, Kent State actually decided to partner with downtown to say, we have a week downtown, we have poor connections, what if we actually construct things to come together? They did so, but they decided to hold a competition for the School of Architecture and Environmental Science to say this 300-foot-long site needs to connect the academy on the right, secondly the university, and the town. So our idea was to actually take that edge, pull it back, open it up, and actually try to pull in these sight lines all the way from the city, if you will, to the university. And again, though, we were on a site that had some topography, and we wanted the studios to be connected in turn. Super simple section, with the studio spaces all looking down at each other, and you can see traces of GSD studios, I'm sure, in this diagram. We just wanted to stretch it out and relax that a little bit further, and also give it an emblematic kind of frontality. So you could start to see here this idea of this kind of mineral content of the brick, below, and then this crystalline kind of horizon on top, very simple diagram. And then this is that main floor. The main floor is very, very public, meant to draw everybody in the university with event spaces, the library, cafe. And when you come up, though, those stairs, there is this invitation to see what's happening with the art and architecture students. And indeed, this was the very first day. Check that out. It's never been this clean since. But we got our photographer in right away. But the point here, though, is that the idea of everybody seeing and being seen in one space became very important, so that they studiously organized studios so that there's crossovers between undergrads and graduates and between each discipline. And again, the review spaces are on the glass corners, so they're acoustically separated but overlooking the studios, but also being seen by people in the studios. So you get the sense of reviews. They're not hidden like they can be so often in private rooms for reviews. So again, you get a sense of that, a little bit more of the mess, which we like even more in the view on the right. And then this is the library, and they actually have a kind of materials sample room, which is up on the top floor there, which is a great study space that looks over the main area here. But what we were very excited about and quite proud of was to actually work with a local brick and work with Belden Brick to come up with a custom brick that would collaborate with the kind of more intimate scale of this residential area. So what you start to see here is that this is a brick that they were somewhat uncertain about, because if you put it in a beehive kiln, it actually has many, many different colors. But we also love the idea of working with them to create a custom brick that came out that was tactile. And you can start to see creating that and designed to only extend out 4 inches, so it didn't need more lateral angles, et cetera. But this beehive kiln is just this old school technology. So the bricks that are drawing on the outside of the kiln versus the ones on the inside come out different colors because they're fired with different intensities, which gives you something very rich as opposed to the more mechanically driven ones. And what it does is it really sets up a kind of texture that's just hard to come by. And we were really thrilled with it. And this becomes then, if you will, the Tiffany window to the academy, this main space where the whole studio spills out and kneels down to the height of all the university buildings. And when we come around to the other side, to the city, this rises up to become the height of the urban buildings that are part of the downtown development. So again, if we think about what it means to be both part of a context that's unique and yet somehow apart from it too, We actually had an opportunity at Cornell Tech to be truly apart from the city of New York, and of course Roosevelt Island is in the city of New York, but it's one that a lot of people have never been to, just inches away. And so it had been, in fact, a hospital there, which Cornell Tech was fortunate to be able to gather this as a campus, but it also is a site subject to flooding. So this becomes pretty interesting when we think about the site that we were given, that blue hexagon, whatever strange site, was a blocking piece that we said, wow, if we put a building right here, you're never going to see from river to river, you're never going to be able to have a building that opens to the landscape. So what if we think about that plot or property line as just a guide? And if we said that our property line really is Manhattan and Queens, that we could draw this river to river portal of views, and that would be the place where this is a co-location building for startups and then also for research folks in the school, very much like the U of T project program that we're working with. So if the idea is to convene these people, let's make them convene in the most attractive space in the middle. So we actually carved these river-to-river views and actually created buildings with 8 sides, so there are a lot more corner offices for these small startups. But the other thing was it created this central open space in section. And in fact, that elevation allowed us to actually deal with some of the flooding issues and actually pulling all our mission critical spaces well above the floodplain. So again, the idea of a vertical place of collaboration takes a lot of breathing room. And so we were able to convince our client that they wanted to actually have very inefficient circulation. In fact, super inefficient, so that the spaces that are typically tight by elevators were generous enough for programs. You can start to see Tom Main's building Morphosis on the right, the Bloomberg Center and our building on the left. The 2 buildings in dialogue with each other. We had a lot of fun actually having our kind of informal meetings and internal critiques of the master plan. And this we're opening onto a green. But we were also intrigued again with borrowing from our neighbors that weren't just architectural, but actually infrastructural. So the fins here are they actually have a kind of a metallic coating on the paint that plays very much with light. And then the structure itself is one that really is super simple. And these prisms, these trusses allowed us to be pretty much column-free inside and create a kind of space that is, pulling you in, open invitation. You can start to see the terracing, this kind of boundary between architecture and landscape being somewhat ambiguous. And the idea is that this open terracing the landscape, which we think is so fantastic, Field Operations did the overall master plan. We designed this amphitheater and worked with them to refine the detailing to correspond with the campus, but effectively gave up some of our footprint for landscape. But that's why it tilts back up in the inside. And again, you saw the Spanish Steps at the very beginning. I think we always love to be inspired by our sort of crush spaces, but we wanted to create a kind of indoor version of it. So each one of these landings here is fully plugged in and powered, and each landing on the stair is about the size of a New York City studio apartment. But the idea here, though, is by pulling this fully apart, you get this river-to-river view. You truly do have this sense of looking across and all the way through the building, and the light draws you in. But it also gives you views, in this case, right over to the master studio, now a kind of collaborative studio for tech. And then in that collaborative studio, they basically reconfigure that room quite a bit. And actually, we were given this great opportunity in the corner to make a kind of tiny, intimate lounge at the most kind of monumentally important corner. And it's fabulous. You feel like you're on the ship because there's no other site in New York City that's anything like this. So to be able to leverage this kind of panoramic view of the water in the city is really quite a privileged space. And again, as we come over to Queens, everybody thinks it's all about the Manhattan views. We actually love these even better. And that sense of being connected to the infrastructure and continuing on up to the laboratory spaces and the loose fit collaboration spaces inside is pretty fantastic. Again, that kind of funny, slender sense of intimacy and monumentality seen right through here with that one space that I was just describing. Now, there's funny little gifts that we always think about when you design in conjunction for a campus, but we had no idea that we were going to have to give a gift to Tom Main's building across the way. And it turns out for his Bloomberg Center to be net zero, we had to add an additional 22,000 square feet of solar canopy on our building, to make that building net zero, but that's just fine, because what it did was that we were able to kind of pull it up a little bit higher. And what we did by making it a little bit higher was we created this fantastic belvedere, if you will, that created a sheltered and sun-shaded roof destination. So it was a very late arrival into the program, very much an ad alternate in the budget, and we were so thrilled to be able to see this green roof realized. And again, you can just start to see what we really love is this idea that at night the buildings and the campus start to have an identity that's now seen not only from Manhattan, but also seen from Queens as a point of curiosity in the middle of an island that has always been a place of dreams. Kahn's sort of Roosevelt Memorial's down at the tip, so if you all get a chance, it's a destination in and of itself. So again, campuses, though, which have been a kind of passion of ours, can be very different when you go to a corporate location. And at Novartis, I'll just show this gateway. We were asked to do, they had a kind of a secure gateway, you know, kind of boundary. Pharmaceutical industry has a lot of issues of security and privacy that are very important to respect. And so we were supposed to do effectively a guard gatehouse visitor center and create a connection with the fence that would actually separate the institution. But we said, well, what if, in fact, the boundary of that fence or wall and the topography of this fabulous, you know, campus landscape could, in fact, be the building? And could we inhabit both the topography and the line of defense of this airside, landside kind of thing? And so it was a very simple diagram of a rectangle that was with the diagonal through it and then pulled and stretched. And in a sense, creating a new sort of idea of pulling you in and sort of getting badged and connected before you're actually taken through the rest of the campus, but being reminded from either side that you're really part of this incredible landscape. It really is a magical setting, and we were fortunate to work with Saley and create this completely self-supporting, unbroken, mullioned glass, which we were really glad that was experimental for them and a gift for this building. And if you start to look at this, again, you could start to see the regular secure fence moving along on one side, but the kind of work, if you will, of the berm and the hillside and the walls doing the rest of the work. But the idea of it really becoming a kind of celestial soffit, so that it is not just a place of boundary and security, but also a place of welcome and shelter, so that everybody who drives by and sees this as the emblem of the campus sees something besides the kind of world of boundaries, but actually a world of invitation. Now, boundaries get very, very fuzzy and different when you do an embassy. And as you can imagine, we're very excited, should be starting construction later on this year. Our design for the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India, had the good fortune of being able to draw on an incredibly rich landscape and architectural tradition in India. And you can start to see the Presidential Palace Gardens in New Delhi, Lodi Gardens in New Delhi. There's just such a fantastic language to draw from. And on the campus grounds of the embassy, you know, half a century ago, Edward Durrell Stone did this fantastic kind of new sort of, I would say, almost kind of the beginnings of tropical modernism. And then you could see he was drawing from the inspiration from the Taj Mahal with the major reflecting pool, this kind of axial sense of importance. And when it opened, you could see that this was visited by many. Jackie Kennedy was one who was so moved by it that she, in fact, invited Edward Durrell Stone to design the Kennedy Center in Washington, which has a striking resemblance to this Chancery building. Our client is no longer in the White House right now, but we certainly appreciated a kind of a larger vision for diplomacy and architecture becoming so important that we could actually draw from tradition in many ways. Michael and I have been intrigued by this notion of the kind of drums and the walls not just being worlds of boundaries, but actually worlds of formal invitation. And you can start to see that this actually set up a possibility of seeing walls and even carving into the landscape so that we could actually create some opportunities to deal with security, but also opportunities to deal with the idea of a wandering landscape. It was a campus, if you will, that was really one building after another on a flat site. And we thought that because the sites are divided by one city road, it's really two major sites, it's 27 acres, if we could create a slaloming identity to the central landscape, it would no longer just be one building after another, but maybe one building because of another linked through landscape. So with that idea of a central green spine, it really was about actually drawing a connective active greenery to become the front address, if you will, so that the old entry where you could see the main chancery on the lower right there with its circular reflecting pool, that entry had to be abandoned for security reasons, so by repositioning our arrivals, we could actually position a new central campus green. Now, what we were interested in is making sure that it was an office building and then the chancery building that exists on the left. So the idea then of recognizing that the weather extremes there of incredibly hot sun, deluge rains, and incredible drought set up a need to do an architecture that respects certain things. The canopy creates incredible shelter from the sun and deluge rains. The reflecting scrim of water actually creates evaporative cooling when you come and arrive. And in a sense, the lighter stones are actually rejecting the heat. So that's really, for us, these are new slides, newly allowable. So you're seeing kind of a debut of this project. I think Architectural Record just had it this month. It just came out as the in-progress phase, and we're eager to see over the next 6 years, seeing it all come to life and constructed. This project that I think was just described earlier, the Olympic Sculpture Park, was a competition that really allowed us to experiment with the idea of building pieces of a city, pieces of a park, pieces of art, and in a sense, on a site that was like no other. The waterfront of Seattle is interesting because it still keeps its industrial identity with its piers and is very real. So real, in fact, that like most waterfronts, it's been choked off through infrastructure so that the city has been divorced from the water's edge. And when the Seattle Art Museum decided to host a competition, they basically said, we have a 9-acre site. They were a little coy that it was actually 3 separate sites divided by a train line, a high-bodied, wide-bodied trucking route, that it had a failing seawall, and it was fully contaminated because it used to be the site for Union Oil, Unocal or whatever. So that was problematic. It also had a trolley barn that they said might not be able to be moved. And we thought, wow, this is like a project for us, you know? It's like very cool. And so we actually came up with an idea that, this is it realized right here. We came up with an idea where we said, what if you could actually imagine something that would wander from the city to the water's edge and in very little effort create a kind of connective landscape that wouldn't conceal the infrastructure but might actually celebrate it. So backing up a little bit, there's a lot of scratching around. And literally we said, well, what if we could deal with this kind of infrastructural X-ray and let everything still happen all at once and not conceal or bury anything? And wouldn't it be cool even if we could create some salmon habitat on the water's edge? And so this was, you know, all crazy fantasies, but in fact, by working on it systemically and thinking about the issue of dealing with the contamination, dealing with the trolley, dealing with the train tracks, dealing with lighting, dealing with the infrastructure, dealing with runoff, dealing with landscape, dealing with art, how could we actually layer all these things so that together they could systemically create something that transcended the one system after another to create something that was simpler and more compelling than that? And it worked out that the whole thing could really be achieved through section. And so you can see this kind of sectional X-ray that allowed us to transcend 40 feet of grade, deal with our clearances with the train tracks and the roads, and also make its way into the subsurface bathymetry of a new beach. So again, what you're seeing here is a few gifts that can happen from time to time. This is 200,000 cubic yards of earth work here that we were really lucky to get for free because they were excavating the space for the downtown museum expansion, and they needed to get rid of their dirt, and we needed their dirt. So it was this great moment of symbiosis. We still had to pay for the shipping down about a mile, but whatever, this was fantastic because it allowed us to work within a very constrained budget. You can start to see this earthwork under construction, but what was fantastic is that we had fabulous engineers, MKA, our civil and structural engineers, and we had a problem where our first estimate with our poured-in-place concrete walls, the walls alone exceeded by 20% the entire budget for the project. So we obviously had a challenge. So this was a case of working with MSE, or mechanically stabilized earth, that could build up just like they do in the highways, and then again, precast panels set here, by the way, made in Canada, and trucked down, another shout out. And these guys were fabulous because they were all designed to actually make their way down on the flatbed truck. But what you can start to see is that the MSE are the kind of gravel gabion baskets. They're set back at a slight reclining angle. And then we said we don't want railings or the thing of architecture messing it up. So we just carried those walls, and they're 42 inches above grade. So effectively, we got all of our guardrails handled there. Now, you'll also see that they're overlapping. And the idea that overlapping is that this is a seismic zone. And so assuming that there's going to be movement, we actually set these walls up so that they could shift and move, and we would never see cracking. So again, these are kind of these technical algorithms that you go to try to set up the excuse of being able to say, ultimately, it's really all about the art and the Olympic mountains off in the distance. And setting that new, if you will, a plinth or a place for art was really the goal. So slaloming people through the site, in many ways, slaloming them through the building were one and the same thing. So that the idea of the pavilion that you could see that meets the city is actually designed and informed and created the very same way of this unfolding, carving, cutting. So again, you can start to see the steepest grade change as we make our way up towards a Seattle Needle. And that gave us a chance to have all of our services and parking garage, et cetera, take advantage of entry on that grade and then bring people in through that upper terrace. You come in, this is really kind of a tough space. It's a Kunsthal, it's flexible, it's basically overstructured so that art can hang on it and land on it, a little cafe. And then you can see this is Pedro Reyes, this fabulous Mexican artist who did this fabulous piece, the mural and the suspended cupolas that you can crawl into and still effectively be looking out on the water. And we cut a slot right in the wall where everybody said they wanted the most art for work, and we said if we can elevate it, anybody who's in a car could be looking in and look out and through to the Olympic Mountains, into the water, but also into the gallery to see the work. Again, through this effort of charcoal drawing, to be able to make your way over the highway in the middle, we were actually able to create this kind of valley because we were already down, we just go up, and that valley created a place for art and created a place to look at the pavilion in a new light. And so this is Richard Serra's piece, Wake, on the left, looking all the way up to the pavilion. You can start to see this idea of wedging and these perspectival convergence creating new spaces. And in fact, that, we joke to Richard Serra that everybody comes in Seattle to bow down to his work from time to time. But it really is, it's fantastic seeing that the park's used for more than just art lovers. Again, one of our favorite photos here by Iwan Bon is actually looking at this idea of the kind of multiplicity and superimposed new infrastructure of the park and the old infrastructure of the train tracks and the highway. And again, this whole idea of making a point, literally, of that intersection of infrastructure and the pedestrian one above, we decided we would really make a point there. And it's a point that people come to so that you're literally standing dead center in the middle of the trucking route, but just a little bit higher here. And you can start to see that idea, that switchback being a point where every route takes you to look at the mountains or back to the port or back to the beach. So it's intensifying the experience of all these views, so much so that even if you're in a car, you are literally and truly visiting the sculpture park. But again, the idea here is seeing that even the idea of crossing the train tracks, we had tough regulations. We had to have a throw fence. It wasn't only vertical, but it was horizontal because, heaven forbid, you can throw things and bodies up and then over. So again, working with an artist, Teresita Fernandez, she had this fabulous idea for actually inhabiting our fence with a glasswork, which she called Seattle Cloud Cover. And it really is a magical piece that she designed here, embedded within the infrastructure. And it too casts with the kind of sunset light, this incredible light that bounces down onto the concrete panels and really sort of changes them into something else entirely. And again, Mark Diane's the vivarium over here with the nurse log. You can start to see the pavilion unfolding. But I think one of the things we're most proud of was we were able to work with the city of Seattle and work with the federal government to actually create a beach that actually has salmon habitat and, in a sense, shore up the kind of failing seawall with something that was actually environmentally and ecologically productive. You can start to see this waterfront really is a kind of a fantastic destination now because you can actually get to it even though they have 20-minute trains that come through because they've just got like 112 cars. Now people can still get to the water in spite of that. But you can start to see that what we were very interested in is creating, rather than big shoring, which would cost a lot of money and not been very environmentally interesting, we were able to create what's called a salmon habitat bench. We had Hart Krauser, our geotechnical engineers, work with our civil and structural engineers to create this fantastic beach that really is excavated, New Pocket Beach. All those logs we got for free. We had specified 11 of them because we had so little money, and then there was a big flood, and we got all these logs for free to kind of become this environment. And so again, they're doing all this habitat monitoring with the University of Washington, and it's doing very, very well. This is for juvenile salmon. Apparently they socialize in certain groups. The chubs have taken over, so there's a little bit of a kind of a warfare going on underwater, but they're monitoring all of it. And let's see if this actually goes. You can start to see again, this is really just to give you a sense of the simultaneity of these kind of paths of movement that are sometimes both intimate and local. Dogs seem to be very, very big fans of the park. In the pavilion, you could start to see the kind of light on one of the artworks there. And, you know, again, it's the infinite nature of that panoramic and that horizon is what's so compelling. The sense of sculpture being seen against a silhouette, Richard Serra's piece seen in the rain, but also through the eyes of children. Seems to be a fantastic spot for people to hear trains. This is one of those mega trains people used to never be able to get to the water because of, but now that's part of the gift of the site. And so our hunch is that when we first finished it, we really wondered if anybody would show up. It's always that fear, but this is opening day, and people really did show up, and we're happy that a lot of people just can't remember that it was ever any other way in the city. So the last project I'll show really has to do with going all the way back to the beginning to Toronto. And as you know, we felt very wistful that we didn't win the Lower Downlands competition, but we sort of had a shot now at the Hunters Point South Waterfront Park with TBA to actually, in Arup, to think about this particular site in a very new way, to say, oh my God, we're opposite Manhattan, so much better to be on the other side of the water to be able to see Manhattan. And so amazing to think of a site that actually turns the corner with Newtown Creek because there's more perimeter and water to be had as a kind of park. Now, what it was, you can start to see the view of Manhattan on the left. That's the site that we found. But what it had been was an industrial site, and prior to that, it had been an incredible wetland site. So this history had been completely annihilated through industry, and even further pointed out its vulnerability with Hurricane Sandy because, of course, it could become a fully submerged landscape. And so our thinking had to do with recognizing that this was a park that was being set up to become the attractor for development, not the leftover sleeve that the developer would pay for because he or she had the right to build high. So this is interesting, and especially it's going to be the largest affordable housing in Manhattan since the 70s. So this is fabulous gift that Bloomberg brought to the city. And so what you can start to see here is that part of the edge of the site we inherited, which was very hard and fortified, so we thought, well, let's work with it. And part of the site was very flat, so we said, let's have the most active recreation there on that one side that you can see with a hard edge. But we were able to say that we could have 12% hard edge, but roughly 88% of the shoreline could be soft. And because it was such a weird site with weird edges, we thought, well, that gives us a lot more perimeter to play with and a lot more identities to play with. And so, in fact, the big gesture was coming through the oval and then unfurling and coming out to a pier jetty that could make its way on the water and allow this site to be fully submerged and yet secure at the same time. The idea was to invite the water in as opposed to reject and fortify. So again, you could even see that in that oval for the green, the idea of allowing water to come in and submit to flooding and then let it rush out, a kind of catch and release system, you can start to see here in the realized oval green. Now, the interesting thing about this oval green is the central part is artificial turf because it has a lot of wear as a rough playing field, and the crescent around it is natural turf. So these are kind of interesting conditions that are tuned for the difference of use. This is a Bernie Sanders rally image that you can see on the left, and then you can see it on the right in its more usual state for soccer because the school's been built right across the street. Again, though, tiny budget, tiny site, infinite views. And what we wanted to do was to tune the architectural elements to frame these incredible views across. And so this is the shade pavilion. And what's interesting is that it's also the portal for the ferry. So it's a place where you wait for the ferry, you're protected from the sun. It's also something that looks out on the water. Now, the interesting thing is that first we were told to do one shade pavilion, one concessions building, one bathroom, and one maintenance shed. And we said, what if we just do them all in one building? And so that's what came of this. And so it's also hardworking. The angles actually collect sun, so it's solar powered and handles all the lighting in the park. The channels collect water, which contributes to the irrigation. So it's really an infrastructural piece, in a sense, in disguise as really a shade pavilion and a concession and restrooms, et cetera. It frames on one side that oval, but on the other side it really creates a newly rejuvenated beach that's quite desirable for families because it actually has access to the restrooms. And then the old rails that actually allowed exchange because of the kind of portal here has been transformed now into a rail garden. And again, you can start to see the overarching view here of phase one, high density playgrounds, dog runs, et cetera. And these incredible views back out with the ferry coming back and forth to the city. Now, phase two, which just opened this past fall, was another story. It was a delay of 5 years before it was able to go forward, and it had the kind of more awkward idiosyncratic topographies. And so our thinking was, why not leverage this topography in ways that, just as we had shown in the lower Dawnlands, we could actually stretch just a little bit further out to give you this sense of the precipice of being high up over the water and connected and reaching back out to the city. And again, from below, saying that the underside of these kind of ships that we see in these port areas are even more exciting even just than the surface. So these were our sources of inspiration, and we were fortunate enough to work with a company in Maine that actually fabricated everything, and this is it being installed with the kind of subsurface truss dropping into place. And this is it as you start to see what it's actually doing. And this view is super important because there's over a 20-foot grade change from the top of the overlook down to the new wetlands. And this is actually nearly an acre of wetlands that we've created. And what you could see is with that zigzag path that gets back to the idea of the walls of fortification or the topography of security that we identified in Novartis and in Delhi, we now have a fortified berm that is really a lookout point. And actually this idea of protecting the water's edge but being almost like you're walking on water is quite exciting. You start to see that pier reaching out. The other infrastructures coming in, bikes, of course, very important. But this view we love because you really do have this moment when you're on this kind of berm that protects the wetlands from the rest of the city. You feel like you're walking on water, and there's no place in New York City where you can get that close to the water's edge. It's pretty intimate. It's pretty dramatic. But also it even has a place of an isolated island, and hidden behind the trees is this one little goofy peninsula that we've now got wetlands behind, so it's very island-like, and it has a sense of privacy and intimacy, even though it's really looking at the grandeur of the city. Again, you can start to see that spectacle of intimacy and nature and urbanity seen together, the top of that pier looking out. And let's see if we can get this going. And this will give you a little bit of a flavor for the life of this setting. Different kind of folks doing exercise in the park. island I was describing with the backdrop of trees. And so, this is the last slide, but I would just close with the sense that, in fact, I think we're all very fortunate to be in the fields that we're in, because very few other fields give you the opportunity to dream in such, I would say, ambitious ways, and then know that the things that are being left behind are going to outlive you as they endure and become part of the city and part of the urban life. So thank you very much for inviting me tonight. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
That Lower Dawnlands project that you didn't win, did it even go ahead? Because I don't recall anything great being down there.
I think that Michael van Valkenburg won the competition, and I think that he's done a fair amount of work on that, right?
Oh, so it just has
Yeah.
fully happened.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah, no, I mean, once you get in those part of the cities, those projects take a long time. The Hunters Point South one was a decade of effort. Yeah.
So, I was wondering about whether you started to think about how to approach the interiors of the buildings from an AODA kind of point of view. So the thing is about the landscape is that, about these buildings in the landscape, you have an enormous amount of space to have both stairs and ramps, and that's kind of incredible fluidity.
Right.
And then in the buildings, you have this kind of beautiful sort of fluidity and these kind of overlooking spaces that are really wonderful. And they're all based on the stairs. And there's an obvious fix for like the obvious answer. You can take the elevator. But I'm wondering if you guys have started to think about a way that you might start to manipulate.
Very much so, and it's very simple. We're very committed to making our buildings both as accessible as possible on a guideline point of view, but also to make that accessibility not feel conspicuously other. And so in many of our buildings, we actually do everything we can to make sure when we have the length to accommodate a ramp, we always do it 1 in 20, not 1 in 12, so that we don't have guardrails or anything, and everybody takes those routes. And Smith Campus Center, I didn't show, but that's exactly what we did to accommodate these major grade changes outdoor to indoor. Once we come inside, though, we do need our vertical transportation assistance, but what we always do, particularly and you could see that at Barnard, you could also see that at the Cornell Tech building, is that when we have tiered landscapes or nano building tiered landscapes with any kind of seating areas, we have the equal situation both on the lowest level and the uppermost level, identically set up, then the intermediate one, so that they're part of that series. So everybody has a chance to be part of the special experiences, even if some of them are not immediately accessible. So it's a big commitment on our part to say that it's not an afterthought or even an obligation that we must meet, but something that we want to meet to embed into the design of those interiors. Yeah.
It's a terrific presentation. Thank you. I'm not an architect, but I find this fascinating. My question to you is related to the durability of these beautiful structures that you design and make in being interfaced with guidelines for future climate scenarios. So I know that on one of the slides you had a FEMA guideline. What scenario in the future does that represent? Is that 30 years hence or 80 years? So I'm just curious.
The FEMA guidelines are actually set up, and they actually have a kind of perspective that exceeds this notion of time. In part, what they're trying to address is that what had been 25 and 50-year expectations are now moving into 10 and 15-year expectations. And so what we always do, and in our projects, is to the extent possible, we allow some areas to be completely submersible so that they aren't problematic, and that we always make sure that our kind of core areas well exceed the FEMA guidelines, because we even think that they're maybe underestimating the challenge. Yeah.
I was just wondering, when you were starting your practice, what tipped you in the direction of, I guess, starting it with Michael versus on your own? What gave you the confidence to do that? What was the driver for that?
Well, that's actually a very good question. When Michael and I first met and we started doing some collaborative things together, I had started teaching. I had my own practice, albeit small, tending to work on residential projects and, some very small things. And Michael had a small thing going on as well when he was teaching later on. And I think what happened was I certainly didn't want a partner, and he certainly didn't want a partner. And we were lucky enough to win 2 competitions, one international and one national, one after the other. So we were kind of stuck. Because when we were asked if we had a firm, it was like a coin toss. We made stuff up. We hired our friend who was a graphic designer to make business cards for us overnight. We went down to the press conference, said we had a firm. I mean, we just kind of made it up, and it worked out. But it was definitely not a kind of a planned thing. It was a kind of a wonderful byproduct of winning a couple of competitions, one after the other.
That's a question for third-year student who's struggling. They all are.
Oh, I can tell you, it just starts out, it's just awful, I mean, because your idea is better than theirs, and you have to act real nice and say theirs is good too, but, you have to go through It's tough, but I think at the end of the day, the great thing about collaboration is not only do Michael and I get the benefit of collaborating together, but we also have a fantastic group of people now in the office. And you have one right here, shout out to Matthew Ferraro, working on the University of Toronto project, and also our collaborators here in Canada, Steve Teeple right there, fantastic people. I think what's so great is that when you have a larger vision about what you're doing, it's no longer about yourself, it's about something larger, and the team you're working with all have an incredibly diverse set of strengths, and in a sense, if you're all looking towards the best outcome, the kind of ego thing you can kind of set aside pretty quickly. You have to go through it once or twice. I think you're pointing out exactly what it did do. It was a catalyst. And you're talking about that one end, the most remote, closest to the water. What existed there was Myrtle Edwards Park, which actually existed as a park. So what we did was we tied our design into that park so that we could leverage it as if they had always been united. So that was a fortunate thing. But in fact, the seawall, which had been coming down, the Army Corps of Engineers said it would be $70 million to replace that seawall. Our budget was half that for the entire park. And so that was problematic, and they said we could only build on the 2 upland parcels, not the waterfront parcel, which kind of missed the point. And so we had fantastic engineers who were able to prove that by that underwater bathymetry that was created, you saw that underwater berm, we could actually shore up that wall without piles, and we could actually create environmental habitat. That, among other things, was catalytic for the thinking about taking down the viaduct and recognizing that the city could actually afford it, because that one fix cost 12% of the original calculations that the Army Corps of Engineers thought that they needed to actually reserve to repair that wall. So when you think around the whole length of the viaduct, how radical that was, it was absolutely a proof of concept project. And our engineers continue to work with field operations on that project. And that really was, I think, one that they said, this is proof of concept that it actually works. There's one in the back. Under the radar. I mean, the question was in the kind of current, I guess I'll paraphrase it, but in our current kind of political environment, is there any constraint on the kind of ambition of this kind of work? And in fact, I don't think there is. I mean, in reality, these kinds of things are larger than four-year election cycles, and the kind of commitment to building these kind of projects well have been situated and well set up by people truly committed to environmental opportunities, to urban opportunities. And so I would argue that fortunately that many of these kinds of initiatives are still somewhat under the radar, and they benefit from being under the radar, because then when they're fully realized, people earn confidence, but they haven't been critiqued to death on their birthplace. Any others? Just, yeah.
As we engage more and more with climate change, we touched on this a little bit with the Delhi Embassy. How do you see the role of landscape architecture specifically being part of the way we're going to tackle, not just to mitigate the damage of design for the climate, but also to try and actually improve and not tackle?
I mean, I think that you've just said something that is so true about what landscape design and landscape architecture is absolutely committed to, which is not just, in a sense, a reactive stance or a kind of territorial stance of defense, but actually designing for can mean many different things. I mean, some people actually think that planting more trees, for instance, is always good, but sometimes actually the environmental detriment of trees need to be considered relative to some larger issues. But I would say that landscape design and landscape thinking is seminal because it's the first non-territorial form of thinking. It's also thinking about waterways, blue trails, green trails, et cetera, and also thinking about the benefit of what the kind of transformation of what we breathe by bringing landscape into life. So I would argue that the dimension of landscape is probably the most seminal dimension in conjunction with infrastructural thinking, because I think that we cannot be innocent about the landscape. It really doesn't just make things lovely. It has to work in a fully integrated and fully designed way. Yeah.
I just wondered if maybe you could say something to the students about the work you were doing in school as a graduate student or an undergraduate student, and how that may have carried forward or influenced what you're doing today.
I mean, it's interesting, you know, I guess all these retroactive manifestos get cast by people's backgrounds, but I would say I was lucky enough as an undergrad at University of Virginia to take architecture studios next to where the landscape department was. So all the landscape studios were right next to ours. They were graduate landscape students, so they were better looking and more confident. And so... And we undergrads actually had the benefit of seeing that they were thinking in a very different way than our 9-square grid, you know, ink line, you know, Cooper Union meets Harvard kind of thinking. Not that there was anything wrong with that, but that's what we were getting in architecture. But the landscape students seemed to be having a hell of a lot more fun. So I think that that sort of backcurrent was very influential. And then in graduate school at Yale, it was really back to the kind of master's thinking. And yet, though, there was one critic who I'm sure all of you know of, Jim Sterling, who his last year of teaching was my last year in graduate school. And he just had this kind of fearless take that the whole scale of the world was his to claim, and yet it could have architectural expression. The diagram was what was taught, and the diagrammatic thinking, which was nailed down our throats, in many ways, I think is the most seminal way, because it meant that the armature of a thesis of organization that could organize a site, could also organize a building, could organize a way of thinking, and could organize a way of ultimate expression. And so in a sense, that recognition that something larger needed to reside all the way through came very much through that graduate thinking. And I remember, though, the most seminal thing that came from Jim Sterling as advice to our young, student population is, I remember saying, oh, Jim, you're such an icon to all of us here, and your things are so cool, and how do you do them? Like, how do you convince your clients? You tell them about your great ideas? And he said, oh, no, I never talk about ideas. I just tell them about technical requirements. Oh, way you get this stuff done. And so I thought it was a very interesting thing, whereas basically strategic communication also becomes necessary. And he, in a sense, embedded in our mind that it wasn't about just getting everybody to fall in love with the designs, but to let them know that they truly were effective on every level. So I would say that was 6 years of education there. Anyway, thank you all very much.